In the early decades of the 19th century, the United States had secured its political independence, but its intellectual life remained firmly tethered across the Atlantic. American thinkers relied heavily on European philosophies and deeply entrenched orthodox traditions to define their worldview. Few people embodied this rigid establishment more thoroughly than Ralph Waldo Emerson. Born into a world defined by strict conformity, he appeared destined to uphold the intellectual status quo of his era. The pressure to conform was literally in his blood. Emerson was the seventh generation in a long, unbroken line of Orthodox Boston ministers. The restrictive, highly formalized environment of New England religious life was his birthright. This traditional foundation was fortified by his Aunt Mary Moody Emerson. She served as his primary intellectual guide, rigorously training the young Emerson in strict religious orthodoxy and classical theology. By all accounts, his background perfectly positioned him to be a lifelong defender of the Church's dogmas. He was groomed to be a pillar of the old world, making the radical rebellion that defined his later life entirely unexpected. In 1829, Emerson married 18-year-old Ellen Tucker. Their union was brief. Less than 2 years later, Ellen died of tuberculosis at the age of 19. The sudden devastation of her death triggered an absolute ideological crisis. Emerson sought solace in the religion he had been raised to preach, but he found that rigid doctrines and historical scripture offered him no comfort. He began to view orthodox traditions as dead bones, disconnected from the reality of human suffering. His grief reached a visceral climax. In a desperate search for answers, Emerson walked 5 miles to Ellen's tomb in Roxbury. He entered the vault and pushed open her coffin to confront the physical decay of the woman he loved. The experience broke his remaining ties to his faith. He resigned his position as a Boston minister shortly after and fled to Europe, searching for a way to survive the spiritual collapse that had consumed him. His search led him to Paris in the summer of 1833, specifically to the botanical exhibits of the Jardin des Plantes. Walking through the Cabinet of Natural History, he spent hours studying case after case of preserved specimens. He was struck by an intense perception of the natural world. He observed how the various forms of flora and fauna were inextricably linked, revealing a deep, organic interconnectedness across all living things. This realization challenged the rigid, mechanical universe of his Puritan upbringing, replacing it with a vision of a world that was thoroughly organic and alive. Confronting the ultimate physical death of his wife had shattered his old beliefs, but it forced him to discover a universally living world in its place. That quiet moment among the botanical gardens planted the vital seed for a distinctly new American philosophy. Emerson returned to America peering the insights he found in the Cabinet of Natural History, ready to test his new observations against the institutions he had left behind. He delivered his first major public strike against the old world in 1837, during the Phi Beta Kappa address at Harvard College. Speaking to the nation's academic elite, Emerson argued that American scholars had become bookworms. Instead of forging original thoughts, they were passively mimicking European history and treating the written records of the past as unquestionable authority. His proposed solution was a concept he called man thinking. To achieve this, an individual must step away from the library and be educated by direct physical experience in nature, propelled by an active, engaged soul. By urging his audience to cast off the restrictive traditions of Europe and draw wisdom from their own immediate surroundings, this single speech served as America's intellectual declaration of independence. The following year, in 1838, Emerson escalated his rebellion by targeting an even more sacred institution, the Orthodox Church itself. He was invited to speak at Harvard Divinity Hall, delivering an address directly to the graduating class of young ministers. Emerson presented a radical argument to the theological students. He stated that historical Christianity relied far too heavily on the revelations of the past, effectively treating God as if he were dead. He issued a direct call to action, urging the graduates to bypass established priests and rigid dogma entirely. True religion, he argued, required every individual to connect directly with the divine in the present moment. The institutional backlash was fierce and immediate. The religious establishment denounced Emerson as an atheist and a corrupter of youth, resulting in a ban from speaking at Harvard that would last for 30 years. The decades-long exile from Harvard pushed Emerson's work out of the pulpit and onto the independent lecture circuit. Operating outside the bounds of the church, he was now free to develop his philosophy without answering to a governing board of ministers. His public rebellions coalesced into a formal movement known as transcendentalism, centralized around his new home in Concord, Massachusetts. The first major pillar of this movement was the concept of self-reliance. Emerson reasoned that because divine intuition lives within every person, trusting one's own inner voice is always superior to conforming to societal expectations or bowing to external authorities. He then introduced a second, more abstract pillar, the Oversoul. This concept integrated the insights of Eastern Vedic philosophy he had studied with the epiphany of interconnectedness he had experienced in Paris. The Oversoul functioned as a supreme, universal spirit, connecting every individual soul into one unified whole. This framework dissolves the boundary between the subjective observer and the objective natural world. Man and nature are expressions of the exact same divine source. Ralph Waldo Emerson believed true perfection could only be found within. He argued society improves only if individuals first perfect their own spirits. So when George Ripley invited him to join Brook Farm, an experimental utopian commune built on shared labor and collective living, Emerson refused. He viewed crowds as a distraction and told Ripley that moving to the commune would be like trading his current life for a prison a little larger. For the young philosopher, joining any social movement meant compromising the soul. He held himself and humanity to a standard of absolute, untouched independence. This printed broadside outlines the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Its brutal reality shattered Emerson's intellectual detachment. Looking at the synopsis below, the law explicitly required free citizens to assist in capturing escaped slaves under threat of severe penalties. The federal mandate made chattel slavery a local crisis. Emerson could no longer stay isolated. He adopted his concept of passive self-reliance into a tool for direct political resistance, urging citizens to break the law. He eventually threw his support behind militant abolitionists, including John Brown. Emerson framed Brown's armed rebellion as the ultimate expression of individual moral courage. Emerson's pursuit of a pure, isolated idealism had finally collided with a political landscape where detached neutrality was no longer a moral option. This stress test extended beyond national politics into his own home. Emerson's closest intellectual peers began to probe the boundaries of his emotional detachment. Margaret Fuller, editor of the transcendentalist journal The Dial, directly confronted what she called his inhospitality of soul. She pushed him to step out of his abstract thoughts and engage in mutual vulnerability, arguing that a philosophy without warm, lived human connection was incomplete. Henry David Thoreau took a different approach. Instead of testing Emerson's emotions, Thoreau tested the absolute physical extremes of self-reliance, taking the philosophy out into the woods of Walden Pond to see if a man could truly sustain himself in nature. Together, Fuller and Thoreau mapped the edges of Emerson's worldview. One highlighted a stark lack of interpersonal warmth, while the other dragged his theories out of the study and into the dirt. Herman Melville offered an even harsher assessment. Melville actually admired Emerson's intellect, calling him a brave thought diver who was willing to plunge into the depths of human consciousness. But Melville rejected Emerson's belief that evil is merely an illusion. He argued that the Concord sage refused to look into the true, dark depths of the human condition. For Melville, Emerson's relentless optimism acted as a blinder, shutting out the physical realities of suffering, malice, and the destructive indifference of nature. Melville diagnosed a severe vulnerability. Emerson's self-reliance was a brilliant intellectual shield built for call weather, untested by actual, inescapable devastation. That devastation arrived with the sudden death of Emerson's 5-year-old son, Waldo. The loss fractured his belief in a harmonious universe. He found himself unmoored from the intellectual certainties that had defined his early career. In his subsequent essay, Experience, he outlined a new realization. Human perception is shifting, unreliable, and heavily dictated by our current moods. He eventually conceded to the power of fate acknowledging that individuals are bound by biology, physical laws, and forces far beyond their control. The great idealist had finally encountered a grief that no amount of solitary self-reliance could think its way through. By the 1870s, the aging champion of radical individualism faced severe aphasia and memory loss. The man who built a career on complete self-sufficiency lost his autonomy. He forgot his own writings and struggled to recognize the faces of his closest friends. Yet he did not fall into despair. He relied entirely on his daughter Ellen and his inner circle, allowing them to assemble his final lectures and shape his remaining work. His twilight years marked a quiet transformation. The rigid boundaries of the self dissolved into a shared consciousness, relying on others to hold the memories he no longer could. This is the stone marker at Author's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. In death, Emerson is physically surrounded by Thoreau, Hawthorne, and the Alcotts, the very peers who challenged and supported him in life. His ultimate legacy rests in this shared ground, testifying to a wisdom that began in radical isolation and ended in profound interdependence.